Ashwood Abbey stood majestically on the outskirts of the small town of Willowbrook, surrounded by ancient oaks and shrouded in perpetual mist. Built in the 18th century, the abbey had once been a sanctuary for monks seeking solace. Over the years, it transformed into a private estate, then a school, and finally abandoned, left to the ravages of time and the weight of untold secrets. The townsfolk rarely spoke of Ashwood Abbey. When they did, it was with a mix of fear and reverence. Tales of ghostly apparitions, unexplained phenomena, and whispers of a curse had woven themselves into local legend. Children dared each other to approach its wrought iron gates, but none had the courage to venture inside. Dr. Alexander Monroe, a professor of paranormal psychology, arrived in Willowbrook on a chilly autumn evening. Known for his unorthodox methods and skepticism of the supernatural, he had dedicated his career to debunking myths and exposing the truths behind legendary hauntings. The mystery of Ashwood Abbey intrigued him like no other. Reports of disappearances, sightings of spectral figures, and the Abbey's dark history presented the perfect opportunity for his next investigation. He checked into the Willowbrook Inn, a quaint establishment run by the jovial Mrs. Henderson. The inn was cozy, with roaring fireplaces and the scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen. As he settled into his room, he reviewed the dossier he had compiled: newspaper clippings, eyewitness accounts, and historical records of Ashwood Abbey. That evening, he ventured to the local pub, the Thistle and Thorn, hoping to gather more first-hand stories. The pub was warm and inviting, filled with the chatter of townsfolk winding down after a day's work. As he approached the bar, the conversations hushed slightly. A newcomer was always a point of curiosity in Willowbrook. "What can I get for you?" asked the bartender, a stout man with a thick beard and kind eyes. "A pint of your finest ale, please," Alexander replied, "and perhaps some local wisdom." The bartender chuckled. "Local wisdom, eh? You're not from around here." "No, I'm visiting. Dr. Alexander Monroe." He introduced himself, extending a hand. The bartender shook it firmly. "Name's Peter." "So, what brings you to Willowbrook, Dr. Monroe?" "I'm a researcher. I'm here to learn more about Ashwood Abbey." A palpable tension settled over the room. Nearby patrons exchanged glances, and the lively atmosphere dimmed. Peter sighed. "Ashwood Abbey's not a place you want to be poking around. Best to let old ghosts rest. I appreciate your concern, but I've made it my life's work to explore such places." An elderly man sitting nearby leaned over. "They say the Abbey's cursed," he muttered. "Those who go looking for trouble often find it." "Have you ever been there?" Alexander asked. "Once, when I was a lad," the old man replied, eyes distant. "Lost a friend that day. He went inside on a dare and never came out." "Did anyone search for him?" "Aye, we did. Found nothing. Not a trace." Peter placed the pint in front of Alexander. "Listen, doctor, the Abbey's been abandoned for a reason. Strange things happen there. Unexplainable things. All the more reason for me to investigate," Alexander said with a determined smile. Peter shook his head. "Just be careful. Willowbrook doesn't need any more tragedies." Returning to his room that night, Alexander felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. He was used to local resistance. Superstitions ran deep in small towns, but there was something different here. The fear seemed genuine, almost protective. The next morning, he set out for Ashwood Abbey. The path was overgrown, leaves crunching underfoot as he navigated through the dense woods. The air grew colder the closer he got, and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring the sun. Reaching the gates, he paused to take in the sight. The abbey loomed ahead, its stone walls weathered and ivy-covered. Gothic spires reached skyward, and shattered stained-glass windows hinted at a once grand interior. The iron gates were locked with heavy chains, but rust had weakened them over time. With a firm push, Alexander managed to slip through. The courtyard was eerily silent. Statues of angels and saints stood watch, their features eroded, giving them a haunting appearance. As he approached the main entrance, a raven cawed from atop a gargoyle, startling him. "Just a bird," he muttered to himself, chuckling at his jumpiness. Inside, the abbey was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs draped from the ceilings like tattered curtains. The scent of damp stone and decay filled the air. He began his exploration methodically, documenting everything with his camera and voice recorder. The great hall was adorned with faded tapestries depicting biblical scenes, and a massive chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling. As he moved deeper into the abbey, he noticed peculiar symbols etched into the walls, intricate designs that didn't match the religious iconography one would expect. He made notes, intending to research their meanings later. In the library, shelves upon shelves of ancient books lined the walls. Most were illegible due to mold and age, but one caught his eye, a leather-bound journal hidden behind a fallen beam. Carefully extracting it, he opened to the first page. Property of Sister Eleanor. May God forgive us for what we have done. Intrigued, Alexander began to read. The entries were dated from the late 1700s and detailed the daily life of the nuns who had resided in the abbey after it was converted from a monastery. June 3, 1792. Strange happenings continue. Sister Margaret swears she hears voices at night, whispering her name. Mother Superior dismisses it as nerves, but I am not so sure. July 12, 1792. Another girl from the village has gone missing. Rumors spread that the abbey is involved. We have done nothing wrong, yet the townsfolk grow suspicious. August 21, 1792. I can no longer ignore the signs. There is a darkness here, something that seeps into our very souls. Last night, I saw a figure in the corridor, a shadow that moved without light. Alexander felt a chill as he read further. The journal ended abruptly with a final, ominous entry. September 5, 1792. They are coming for us. May God have mercy on our souls. He closed the journal, his mind racing. What had happened to Sister Eleanor and the others? There were no historical records of the abbey after that year. It was as if it had been erased from history. A sudden sound echoed through the halls, a faint melody, like a music box playing a haunting lullaby. He followed the sound, his footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The melody led him to a small chapel within the abbey. An ornate altar stood at the front, and above it, a stained glass window depicted an angel with wings spread wide, but the angel's face was obscured by cracks in the glass. On the altar lay an old music box, its lid open, the delicate tune filling the air. As he approached, the music stopped abruptly. "Hello," he called out. "Is anyone there?" Silence. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Reaching for his voice recorder, he spoke softly, found a music box in the chapel. Music stopped on its own. Possible signs of residual energy. Suddenly, a whisper echoed behind him, indistinct but unmistakable. He spun around, but no one was there. "Is someone here?" he asked. A gust of wind swept through the chapel, extinguishing the few rays of light that pierced the stained glass. The atmosphere grew oppressive, and shadows seemed to dance along the walls. Alexander took a deep breath, reminding himself that fear could play tricks on the mind. He decided to continue his exploration, moving toward the abbey's east wing. As he entered a long corridor, he noticed that the symbols he'd seen earlier were more frequent here, carved deeply into the stone. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he found himself in a chamber that appeared to be a dormitory. Rows of simple beds lined the walls, and personal belongings were still scattered about, as if abandoned in haste. On one of the beds lay a locket. Picking it up, he opened it to find a faded photograph of a young woman, a nun, judging by her attire. On the opposite side, an inscription read, "To my dearest Eleanor." His heart quickened. Was this Sister Eleanor from the journal? A sudden coldness enveloped the room. His breath formed misty clouds, and a sense of dread washed over him. "Alexander," a voice whispered, barely audible. He froze. "Who said that?" "Help us," the voice echoed, sounding like multiple voices layered upon each other. He scanned the room, but saw no one. Deciding it was time to leave, he headed back toward the main hall. As he walked, footsteps echoed behind him, matching his pace. He quickened his steps, and the footsteps did the same. Breaking into a run, he darted down the corridors, trying to remember the way out. Turning a corner, He collided with something solid and fell backward. "Easy there," a voice exclaimed. Looking up, he saw a woman standing before him, her auburn hair tied back and a camera slung around her neck. "Who are you?" he asked, scrambling to his feet. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied with a wry smile. "I'm Claire Thompson, freelance journalist." He relaxed slightly. "Dr. Alexander Monroe. I'm investigating the Abbey." "Looks like we have the same idea," she said. "I saw you enter earlier and thought I'd join the party." "You followed me?" he asked, a hint of irritation in his voice. "Well, I wasn't sure if you were a vandal or another curious soul like myself." He sighed. "This place isn't safe. We should leave." "Why? Because of the ghosts?" she teased. "Something like that," he muttered. "Look, I've been researching Ashwood Abbey for months. The disappearances, the legends, there's a story here. I've found some unsettling things," he admitted, showing her the journal. As she skimmed through it, her eyes widened. "This is incredible. Proof that something happened here." A loud crash echoed from somewhere above them. They exchanged a glance. "That didn't sound good," Claire said. "Let's get out of here," Alexander urged. They navigated through the twisting corridors, but the Abbey seemed to shift around them. Passages led to dead ends, and familiar landmarks disappeared. "It's like a maze," Claire said, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Stay close," Alexander instructed. They found themselves back in the chapel, the music box now playing again on its own. "That's not creepy at all," Claire whispered. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming humanoid shapes that moved toward them. "Run!" Alexander shouted. They sprinted toward what they hoped was the exit, the shadows in pursuit. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Bursting through a set of double doors, they found themselves in the courtyard. The mist had thickened, and darkness was falling rapidly. "This way." Claire pointed to a gap in the fence. They slipped through and didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the woods. Breathing heavily, they looked back. The Abbey stood silent, its silhouette menacing against the darkening sky. "What the hell was that?" Claire gasped. "I don't know," Alexander admitted, "but it's not something we can face unprepared." They returned to the Willowbrook Inn, where Mrs. Henderson greeted them with concern. "You both look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked. "Something like that," Alexander replied. They sat down in the lounge, sharing their experiences. "I've heard stories about Ashwood Abbey, but I never believed them," Claire said. "There's more to this place than legends," Alexander agreed. "I think the nuns were involved in something darker." "Like what?" "Some kind of ritual or summoning. Those symbols weren't Christian. They seemed more occult." Claire pulled out her laptop. "I took photos of the symbols. Let's compare notes." As they analyzed the images, they found a match in an old tome on demonology. The symbols were linked to rituals intended to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. "This can't be a coincidence," Alexander said. "Something went terribly wrong." Mrs. Henderson approached them hesitantly. "I couldn't help but overhear. You should let this go." "Mrs. Henderson, do you know something about the Abbey?" Claire asked gently. She sighed, taking a seat. "My grandmother told me stories. Her mother was one of the last nuns at Ashwood Abbey." Alexander leaned forward. "Please, any information could help." "The Abbey was plagued by illness," Mrs. Henderson began. "Children from the village were dying, and the nuns were desperate to save them. They turned to forbidden practices, trying to summon a healing spirit. But they summoned something else," Alexander surmised. She nodded solemnly. "An evil presence was unleashed. The nuns tried to contain it, sacrificing themselves in the process. The Abbey was abandoned, and the town vowed never to speak of it again." "Why keep it a secret?" Claire asked. "Fear. Shame. The hope that if we forgot, the darkness would remain sealed." Alexander exchanged a glance with Claire. "I think the seal is weakening. What can we do?" Mrs. Henderson asked, worry etched on her face. "We need to find a way to banish the entity," Alexander said. "Complete the ritual the nuns started." "Is that even possible?" Claire questioned. "We have to try," he replied resolutely. They spent the next day gathering supplies and researching banishment rituals. Consulting old texts and Mrs. Henderson's family records, they pieced together the necessary steps. That night, they returned to the Abbey. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a palpable tension. Armed with candles, protective charms, and determination, they entered the foreboding structure. The path to the chapel was direct this time, as if the Abbey was guiding them. The music box played softly upon their arrival. "Ready?" Alexander asked. Claire nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. They arranged candles in a circle around the altar, inscribed protective symbols, and began reciting the incantation they had prepared. As they chanted, the shadows gathered, forming into the ominous entity that had pursued them before. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed, voice echoing unnaturally. "We're not here to fight," Alexander declared. "We're here to release you." The entity recoiled. "Lies. The nuns tried to bind you, but we're offering you freedom," Claire added. The entity hesitated, its form flickering. They continued the ritual, voices steady despite the mounting pressure. The candle's flames grew brighter, and a vortex of light enveloped the entity. A deafening scream resonated through the Abbey as the entity was drawn into the light. The force knocked them to the ground, and then silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The air was clear, and moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. "Did it work?" Claire whispered. "I think so," Alexander replied. Helping her up, a soft voice echoed around them. "Thank you." They turned to see a faint apparition of Sister Eleanor, her face serene. "The Abbey is at peace now," she said. "Our souls can rest." "You're welcome," Alexander said softly. She smiled before fading away, leaving them standing in the tranquil chapel. Back at the inn, they recounted their experience to Mrs. Henderson, who was relieved and grateful. "Willowbrook owes you a debt," she said. In the following days, word spread of their deed. The townsfolk were cautious but appreciative. The shadow that had loomed over Willowbrook for centuries was gone. Alexander and Claire decided to document their findings, co-authoring a paper that blended history, psychology, and the paranormal. "What's next for you?" Claire asked as they prepared to part ways. "There's always another mystery," Alexander replied with a smile. "Care to join me?" She grinned. "I think I just might." As they drove away from Willowbrook, the Abbey stood silently against the horizon, no longer a place of fear but a monument to the resilience of those who dared to confront the unknown. Months later, Alexander and Claire returned to Ashwood Abbey, this time accompanied by a team of historians and preservationists. Their goal was to restore the Abbey, honoring its history while ensuring that its past remained at rest. During the restoration, a hidden chamber was discovered beneath the chapel. Inside were artifacts and writings that provided deeper insights into the nuns' lives and their ultimate sacrifice. The Abbey was transformed into a museum and cultural center, attracting visitors intrigued by its rich history and the stories of bravery and redemption. Alexander and Claire continued their work together, exploring mysteries and uncovering truths bound by their shared experiences. Yet, on quiet nights when the wind whispered through the trees, some claimed to hear faint strains of a music box playing a haunting melody, a gentle reminder of the Abbey's enduring legacy and the mysteries that still lingered in the shadows. To this day, the full story of Ashwood Abbey remains an unsolved mystery. While the haunting ceased and peace was restored, questions linger about the true nature of the entity and the depths of the Abbey's secrets. Visitors often report feeling a presence, benign but ever watchful. Whether it's the spirits of the nuns keeping vigil or remnants of energies long past is a matter of personal belief. The Abbey stands as a testament to the thin veil between the known and the unknown, inviting all who enter to ponder the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding.